Imagine, for a moment, the air. It's thick, heavy with the scent of jasmine, oud, and human fear, a perfume of power that clings to the marble walls of the Topkapi Palace. You are one of 100 new faces, standing shoulder to shoulder in a hall of dizzying opulence. Light filters through carved screens, catching on the gold thread in your simple tunic and the terrified sweat on your brow. Before you stands the Kislar Aga, the chief black eunuch, a man whose gaze holds the weight of absolute authority. His eyes, cold and appraising, move over you like a merchant inspecting livestock. This is the heart of the Ottoman Empire's secret world, the Imperial Harem, a gilded cage, a golden prison, a place where a single glance from the Sultan can mean unimaginable luxury, or a silent, watery grave in the Bosphorus. A girl beside you, no older than 15, makes a soft choking sound and her eyes roll back, her body slumping to the polished floor with a sickening thud. No one moves to help her. No one dares. Her fate is sealed, her weakness an unforgivable sin in a place built on the illusion of perfection. You are a name whispered on a manifest, a piece of flesh in a grand political machine. The Sultan, a figure you have never seen, is not a man, but a god, a terror, a myth whose desires will dictate your every breath from this moment forward. Can you imagine the psychological torture of it? The slow, creeping dread of knowing that your life is no longer your own, but a fragile gift, held in the hands of a hidden master? And now please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to keep making videos like this, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. Before the palace, before the suffocating perfume and the crushing weight of imperial eyes, there was the wind. The clean, sharp wind of the Caucasus Mountains, a wind that carried the scent of pine and wild herbs and the sound of a language she was forced to forget. Her name was Lelia, and her world was one of snow-capped peaks and green valleys, a life defined by the rhythm of seasons, not the chiming of a palace clock. But that world was shattered in a storm of hooves and steel. The Crimean Tartars, the empire's designated wolves, descended upon her village not with the clamor of an army, but with the chilling efficiency of reapers in a field of wheat. There was no grand battle, only screams swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. She was ripped from her mother's arms, her identity torn away with the same casual violence as the modest jewelry from her ears. The journey that followed was a descent into a hell she couldn't have conceived. Chained in the suffocating hold of a slave ship, the air thick with the stench of sickness and despair, the only currency was survival. The human cost was staggering, a brutal calculus of loss that the slavers absorbed as a simple business expense. Those who died were unceremoniously tossed into the churning Black Sea, their lives erased without a second thought. Lelia learned to be invisible, to make herself small, to quell the fire in her eyes lest it attract the wrong kind of attention. She witnessed unspeakable cruelties, the casual degradation of human beings into chattel, their spirits broken long before their bodies were sold. At the great slave market of Kaffa, a teeming hub of human misery, she was paraded on a wooden block, her teeth inspected, her limbs prodded, her worth debated in a language she did not understand. She was no longer Lelia. She was an object, a potential, a piece of Circassian beauty, prized for its pale skin and rumored docile nature, a future vessel for the Sultan's pleasure. When the palace agent's eyes fell upon her, there was no relief, only a new kind of terror. She had been purchased not for a merchant's home, but for the Padishah himself, the shadow of God on earth. She had survived the fire of the raid and the filth of the ship, only to be delivered into the heart of the empire's most sophisticated and soul-crushing machine, a place from which there was no escape. Her arrival at the Topkapi Palace was not an entry but an absorption. Lelia, the girl from the mountains, ceased to exist the moment she passed through the gate of salutation. She was stripped, washed with scented oils that failed to scrub away the filth of her journey or the lingering trauma in her soul, and given new clothes of fine linen. Then came the ultimate act of erasure, the renaming. A senior Kalfa, a woman whose own past had been similarly obliterated decades before, looked her over with a dispassionate eye and declared her Gulbahar, the Rose of Spring. It was a pretty name, a poetic name, and a lie. It buried Lelia under layers of silk and expectation. a new identity grafted onto her like a mask. She was now part of the Harem-i-Humayun, the Imperial Harem, a world within a world, governed by its own ferocious logic. Here, power was not wielded by men with swords, but by women with whispers. At the apex of this feminine universe sat the valid Sultan, the Queen Mother, a figure of almost mythical authority. She was the true ruler of this domain, her influence extending far beyond the harem walls into the politics of the entire empire. It was she who managed the harem's vast wealth, who approved appointments, who could make or break the most powerful viziers with a carefully chosen word to her son, the Sultan. Below her existed a complex and unforgiving hierarchy. Gulbahar began at the very bottom as an odalisque, a chambermaid in training, one of hundreds of new girls learning the intricate dance of survival. She learned to speak Ottoman Turkish, to memorize passages from the Quran, to play the oud, and to move with a grace that belied the terror coiling in her stomach. Above her were the gediklis, the concubines in waiting, those who had mastered their training and were deemed worthy of potentially being presented to the Sultan. Higher still were the guzdis, the favored ones, who had caught the Sultan's eye and spent a night with him, and then the iqbals, the fortunate ones, who had borne him a child. Each rank came with greater privilege, more luxurious quarters, finer clothes, more servants, but also with greater danger. The harem was a snake pit of jealousy and ambition, where a misplaced word or a rival's lie could send a girl from the heights of favor to the depths of disgrace, or worse. The complicit system enforcers, the eunuchs and the senior kalfas, were the arbiters of this brutal system, their loyalty sworn not to the girls, but to the institution itself. Gulbahar learned quickly that to be seen was a risk, but to remain invisible was to have no future. She was trapped in a paradox, a beautiful, terrifying labyrinth, where every corridor promised either promotion or oblivion. The true wardens of this gilded prison were the eunuchs, men trapped in a liminal state between slave and master, their own humanity sacrificed for a unique and terrible form of power. At their head stood the Kislar Aga, the chief black eunuch, a figure whose influence was second only to the Grand Vizier and the valid Sultan. He was a terrifying specter, often an Ethiopian or Sudanese man captured in his youth, who had risen through the ranks by a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and an unwavering loyalty to the dynastic system. His official title was Master of the Girls, but his authority was far more profound. He controlled access to the Sultan, managed the harem's immense properties and endowments, and served as the crucial link between the secluded inner world of the palace and the political machinations of the state. His presence was a constant, unnerving reminder of the Sultan's absolute power. He moved through the perfumed halls in silent, flowing robes, his face an impassive mask that betrayed nothing of the secrets he knew or the fates he controlled. For the women of the harem, his favor was a shield, his displeasure a death sentence. He was the one who oversaw the selection of new girls from the slave markets, the one who disciplined them for infractions, and the one who ceremoniously led a chosen concubine down the golden path to the Sultan's chambers. Can you imagine the psychological profile of such a man? A man robbed of his own future, his own lineage, who then dedicated his life to guarding the lineage of his master. His power was immense, but it was a borrowed power, one that existed only within the confines of the palace. He was the ultimate complicit system enforcer, a man whose personal tragedy had been twisted into a tool of institutional control. The lesser eunuchs, the kapu agas and their subordinates, formed the nervous system of this oppressive structure. They were the guards, the messengers, the spies. They watched everything, heard everything. They reported on rivalries between concubines, on the shifting moods of the valid Sultan, on any sign of dissent. They too were victims, stolen from their homes and brutally mutilated. Yet they became perpetrators, enforcing the very system that had unmade them. Their desensitization was a survival mechanism, their cruelty a reflection of their own inner emptiness. They were the gears in the machine, the silent, ever-present enforcers who ensured that the walls of the harem were not just physical, but psychological, trapping the women in a web of constant surveillance and fear. The god at the center of this intricate universe, the sun around which all these terrified planets orbited, was Sultan Ibrahim I. To call him a dysfunctional tyrant would be a profound understatement. He was a catastrophe, a walking embodiment of how absolute power, when invested in a broken mind, becomes a force of pure destruction. Ibrahim's madness was not born in a vacuum. It was forged in the chilling silence of the cafes, the cage, a set of opulent rooms within the palace where potential heirs to the throne were imprisoned for decades to prevent them from fomenting rebellion. For 22 years, from his early teens until he was thrust onto the throne, Ibrahim lived in constant terror of the executioner's bowstring, a fate that had befallen his 4 older brothers. He emerged from this gilded prison not as a leader, but as a deeply scarred and psychologically shattered man, plagued by crippling headaches, violent tremors, and a profound detachment from reality. His sexual dysfunction, a direct result of his traumatic confinement, metastasized into a political psychosis. He became obsessed with fulfilling every perverse fantasy that flickered through his damaged mind, using the full power of the Ottoman state to service his bizarre and often cruel whims. His agents were dispatched across the empire with grotesque orders to find him the most corpulent woman in the world, to procure rare and exotic aphrodisiacs, to line his chambers with expensive sable furs, not for warmth, but for the sheer sensory pleasure of it. The harem, for him, was not a place of procreation or even simple pleasure. It was a laboratory for his twisted desires. He would force his concubines to engage in humiliating games, to play the part of animals, or to simply stand for hours while he watched them, his moods shifting from infantile glee to terrifying rage without warning. The women, including the young Gulbahar, lived under the shadow of a tyrant whose cruelty was not strategic, but terrifyingly random. His paranoia, born in the cage, now infected the entire court. He saw assassins in every shadow and plots in every whisper, leading to the arbitrary execution of viziers, generals, and palace staff. This was the man Gulbahar was being trained to please. Not a statesman, not a warrior, but a deeply wounded child in the body of an emperor, whose tantrums could and would cost hundreds of lives. The entire machinery of the harem, with its rigid rules and ancient traditions, was now enslaved to the chaotic whims of a madman. Life within the harem was a study in profound contradiction, a place where soul-crushing boredom coexisted with heart-stopping terror. For Gulbahar and the hundreds of other odalisks, the days were governed by a strict and monotonous routine. Their education was not meant to enlighten, but to mold them into perfect ornaments for the Sultan's collection. They spent hours learning to read and write Ottoman Turkish, a skill that many would use only to read the Quran or, if they were exceptionally lucky, to write letters on behalf of a powerful Khaden or the valid Sultan. They were drilled in the arts of music, learning to play the kanun and the oud, their melodies drifting through the latticed windows, a beautiful soundtrack to a life of imprisonment. They learned to dance, not with the joyful abandon of their lost childhoods, but with a calculated, sensual grace designed to captivate a single, all-important spectator. They were taught etiquette, how to walk, how to speak, how to serve a cup of coffee without a single tremor in their hands, knowing that any perceived flaw could result in harsh punishment from the overseeing Khalifas. This was the veneer of the gilded cage, the shimmering silks, the jewels gifted for good behavior, the fragrant gardens of the fourth courtyard, the exquisite tilework that seemed to bloom on every wall. But beneath this surface of opulent beauty lay a reality of profound psychological warfare. The harem was a closed system, a pressure cooker of ambition and despair. Friendships were dangerous commodities, easily betrayed for a chance at advancement. A girl's only hope for a life beyond servitude was to catch the Sultan's eye, to become a guzda. This singular goal pitted every woman against every other. A stolen piece of jewelry, a whispered lie about a rival's origins, a staged accident during a dance lesson, these were the weapons in a silent, vicious war. Gulbahar felt the constant weight of being watched, not just by the eunuchs, but by the hundreds of other girls whose eyes held the same desperate mixture of hope and jealousy as her own. She became close to another Circassian, a girl named Ilara, who still spoke of the mountains in hushed whispers. But even this small comfort was fraught with peril, a vulnerability in a world that rewarded ruthlessness. The air itself seemed charged with unspoken threats, the beautiful patterns on the Iznik tiles feeling like the intricate webs of a spider. The luxury was a trap, a way to make the prison more palatable, but a prison it remained. The moment came, as it always did, without warning. It was not a grand ceremony, but a casual, almost indifferent event. Sultan Ibrahim was passing through one of the harem courtyards, his gaze distant and unfocused, when it fell upon Gulbahar. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. She saw not the terrifying god of her imagination, but a haunted, fleshy man with a deep weariness in his expression. Yet that single glance was enough. Later that day, the Kislar Aga approached her, his face as impassive as ever. He dropped a small embroidered handkerchief at her feet. It was the signal. The Hunkar, the sovereign, had chosen her. The news spread through the harem like wildfire, a shockwave of envy and fear. Gulbahar was immediately separated from the other girls, her status transformed in an instant. The hours that followed were a blur of ritualized preparation. She was taken to the hammam, the bathhouse, and scrubbed and perfumed by senior attendants until her skin was raw. They dressed her in a gown of shimmering silk, so fine it felt like water against her skin, and adorned her with jewels that felt heavier than chains. Her terror was a cold, physical thing, a stone in her stomach. All her training, all the whispered lessons about how to please the master, now felt like a cruel joke. This was not a romantic assignation. It was a state-sanctioned ordeal, a performance upon which her entire future depended. As night fell, she was led by the Kislar Aga and his attendants to the Altinyol, the Golden Path, a private corridor that connected the harem to the sultan's chambers. The silence of the walk was absolute, broken only by the soft rustle of her gown and the frantic, hammering beat of her own heart. The path was dimly lit, the gilded walls seeming to press in on her. Each step was a step away from the girl she had been and towards an unknown, terrifying future. When she was finally presented at the threshold of the Sultan's private apartments, she was instructed to enter, to walk to the foot of the Sultan's bed, and to wait. The encounter itself was a surreal and dehumanizing experience, devoid of passion or connection. It was a transaction, a duty, her body an instrument for the Sultan's fleeting, erratic pleasure. She focused on a single point on the canopy above, her mind retreating to a place deep within herself, a place the Sultan could not touch. When it was over, she was expected to retreat, walking backwards, never turning her back on the sovereign. As she stumbled back down the golden path, the scent of the Sultan's heavy perfume clinging to her, she did not feel triumphant. She felt hollowed out, a vessel that had been used and set aside. She had survived, but she wondered, in the cold, pre-dawn silence, what part of Lelia was left inside the shell of Gulbahar. Surviving the first night with the Sultan elevated Gulbahar to the coveted rank of Gozde, one of the favored. The change in her daily life was immediate and stark. She was moved from the crowded dormitory of the odalisks to a semi-private chamber, shared with only one other Gozde. She was given a new wardrobe of exquisite silks and brocades, and a small personal staff of 2 junior girls to attend to her. But this new status was a precarious perch, not a secure fortress. The privileges were intoxicating, but they came at the price of intensified scrutiny and a far deadlier form of jealousy. The subtle rivalries of the dormitories now escalated into open political warfare. Every other Gozde, and the more powerful Iqbals who had already borne the Sultan's sons, saw her as a direct threat to their own standing. A woman's power in the harem was directly proportional to the Sultan's favor, a commodity that was both finite and notoriously fickle, especially with a man as unstable as Ibrahim. The Valide Sultan, Qasim, a master of political survival, now watched Gulbahar with a hawk's eye, assessing her potential. Was she a harmless dalliance for her troubled son, or a potential new power player who might one day challenge her own authority? Gulbahar had to navigate a treacherous court where a compliment could be a veiled threat and a gift could be a subtle poison. Her former friend Elara now viewed her with a cold distance, the chasm of rank having opened between them. It was in this environment that the harem's dark mysteries unfolded. A few weeks after Gulbahar's elevation, one of the more established Iqbals, a woman named Aisha who had been openly contemptuous of the new favorite, suddenly fell ill with a violent stomach ailment and died within a day. The official cause was given as tainted food, a common enough occurrence. But the whispers told a different story. They spoke of the Khaden's chief servant being seen near the palace apothecary, of a quiet meeting with one of the eunuchs loyal to a rival faction. There was no investigation. There was never an investigation. A body was quietly removed, and life continued. This was the harem's brutal logic. Problems were not solved. They were erased. Gulbahar was horrified, but she also understood the chilling message. This was the fate of those who lost the game. She learned to be cautious, to trust no one, to master the art of the pleasant but meaningless smile. The Sultan's calls became more frequent, and with each visit, her standing grew, but so did the target on her back. She was no longer just a victim of the system. She was now an active participant, her survival dependent on outmaneuvering those who wished for her downfall. The gilded cage had become a political arena, and the stakes were life and death. The precarious balance of Gulbahar's new life and the lives of every soul in the Topkapi Palace was shattered by an act of such monumental and insane cruelty that it would become a dark legend. Sultan Ibrahim's paranoia and perverse imagination had reached a fever pitch. One morning, after a night of supposed whispers and discovered secrets, perhaps a fabricated story fed to him by a rival faction, or perhaps a simple nightmare that his broken mind twisted into reality, he descended into a state of absolute fury. A rumor, it was said, had reached him that one of his concubines had been compromised by an outsider. Rather than attempt to find the single supposed culprit, his madness demanded a cataclysmic, all-encompassing solution. He issued an order that defied all reason, a command so grotesque it stunned even his most hardened officials. He ordered that his entire harem, every odalisque, every gozd, every iqbalbe, executed. The number varies in the telling, but most accounts place it at nearly 280 women. Gulbahar, along with everyone she knew, was to be drowned. The complicit system enforcers, the eunuchs and palace guards who had dedicated their lives to the Sultan's will, were now tasked with carrying out this act of mass murder. The palace devolved into chaos. The initial disbelief gave way to raw, primal terror. Women who had been bitter rivals moments before now clung to each other, their screams echoing through the marble halls. The guards, their faces grim and unreadable, moved with a brutal efficiency. Gulbahar, along with the others, was bound and forced into heavy sacks. The sheer, systematic nature of the cruelty was its most horrifying aspect. This was not a crime of passion, but a bureaucratic extermination. The women, weighted down, were loaded onto boats. Gulbahar could hear the muffled sobs and desperate prayers of the others around her. Their terror, a palpable presence in the suffocating darkness of her own sack. The boats were rowed out into the cold, gray waters of the Bosphorus Strait. Then, one by one, the sacks were heaved overboard. Gulbahar felt the shocking plunge into the icy water, the weight pulling her down instantly. The sack filled with water, the fabric clinging to her face, choking her. Her last sensation was the crushing pressure of the deep, the silent, indifferent current of the strait swallowing the final, desperate struggles of 280 lives. A single, insane whim had erased an entire world, its secrets, its rivalries, and its sorrows sinking into the dark oblivion of the sea. The mass drowning in the Bosphorus was the act that finally broke the empire's tolerance for its mad sultan. The ulema, the religious authorities, and the janissaries, the elite infantry who had long been disgusted by Ibrahim's decadent and erratic rule, could no longer stand by. Just days after the atrocity, they moved against him. Ibrahim was deposed in a swift and decisive coup, dragged not from his throne, but from his terrified hiding place in the palace gardens. He was returned to the one place he truly feared, the cage. His reign of 8 years, 7 months, and 9 days was over. 10 days later, on the 18th of August, 1648, the executioners entered his cell, and the bowstring that had haunted his entire life was finally drawn tight around his neck. But his death did not erase his legacy of terror, nor did it end the institution that had both created and enabled him. A new sultan, Ibrahim's 6-year-old son Mehmed IV, was placed on the throne, and the great grinding machine of the Imperial Harem continued. Another generation of girls would be brought from distant lands, stripped of their names, and absorbed into the system. The valid Sultan, Kusum, who had likely played a role in her son's downfall to preserve her own power, would continue to rule from behind the curtain. For the world outside, the drowning was a half-believed rumor, a sensationalist story that highlighted the exotic brutality of the Ottoman court. But for those within the palace, it was a ghost that would forever haunt its halls. What became of the women like Gulbahar, the former Lalia from the Caucasus? They became nothing. They were a footnote in the reign of a madman. Their individual stories, their hopes, their fears, their very existence, completely annihilated. They have no graves, no monuments. Their memory exists only as a collective noun, the harem of Ibrahim. Can we even begin to comprehend the scale of that human cost? The thousands upon thousands of women across the centuries whose entire lives were consumed by this one institution, their identities systematically erased, their bodies and futures belonging to a single man they may never have even met. The gilded cage was a marvel of political and social engineering, a system of perfect control. But its beauty was a veneer over a foundation of profound human suffering, a beautiful, intricate trap that devoured the lives of the helpless for the pleasure of the powerful.